Hi, welcome to another one of our videos, and today with really good education one about ACL injuries in sport, and particularly with females. I'm going to be discussing the reasons why females are at greater risk. Alright, so let's get into it. So firstly, ACL injury, which is basically the anterior cruciate ligament around the knee. Basically what it is usually it's either stretched, partially torn or completely torn. The most common injuries are the complete tears. When that happens, there's a huge amount of swelling, a great deal of instability, not always a pain with it, unusual in some cases. Some people have complete ruptures but no pain, but they will have complete instability, so they'll feel like they're going to collapse from just walking and doing simple things. So where in other cases people have extreme pain and lots of and it can be, even though it's the same injury. All right, typical of these is a great deal of rehabilitation following, and it's why it's sort of known as a season-ending injury, and in some cases career-ending. All right, so in approximately 50% of the cases, other structures of the knee, such as the ligaments, the cartilage, the meniscus, are also damaged, and that's where like a lifetime of osteoarthritis and all sorts of other trouble sets in, and and unfortunately that's sort of why this injury is such a bad injury to get for anyone who plays sports. And the typical time for rehab is 9 to 12 months, and more than 50% of the athletes never are the same after that injury. An example here's Derrick Rose from the Chicago Bulls, and he was the MVP in the NBA in 2011, and ever since then he's never really rediscovered his the talent that he had prior to that. And he was at the top of his game in a sport worldwide played. So it just shows you that this can be, if you can prevent this from happening, you'd really want to do it. All right, so what causes the ACL injury? Well, the underlying mechanism is often the sudden rapid change of direction. So in basketball, it's the change of direction from going from a right hand to left hand, cutting across or pivoting. Single leg landing is also a big one, just stopping and decelerating. So sometimes it's collision, so when someone lands on your leg in a tackle in football or something like that, but more than 2/3 of them are non-contact injuries, so from a cut like this and then the knee just goes, or from a landing or pivoting in soccer or something like that. So typical of games that require a lot of that are the basketball, football, netball, soccer. So if you're playing these, you're already at risk. The risk just increases with more and more things that are putting you in a poor position, right, which is what I'm going to discuss. So ACL injury in females tends to be 2 to 3 times higher in sports like soccer, and as much as 5 to 8 times higher in sports like basketball. There's good books you can read, and you can find all these stats about that. In the AFL, I think they're reporting it about 5 times higher than the males. So, which is pretty consistent with the other sports. But the real big question is why is there more in females than males? What is there that's different about that? And, well, there's many things. So firstly, it's not bad luck, and it's nothing to do with the field they play on. Fatigue is an element involved with it, but if that was the case, every girl who was fatigued would also do it. So it plays a part in it, but there's a lot bigger things that are at play, and the main ones are poor neuromuscular control. So that's the main one. All right, which means poor movement patterns, poor motor control with many joints working at once. And this is where a lot of time needs to be spent here, learning this, or otherwise, you've really increased your chances greatly. Anatomy, and I'm going to go into great detail, I'll show you pictures of this in a second. So wider pelvis, anterior tilt, quad to hamstring ratio, general joint laxity in females, and if it's a joint, well, the knees even more so. Poorly designed strength programs, or just lack of strength training in general, and even when they are used, like looking for the cause of, which is really coming back to this neuromuscular and motor control problems, they're really where you need to be looking at, instead of just treating muscles like VMO and or doing Nordic hamstring curls and stuff like that. If you don't treat where it's coming from, you're never going to change a thing. So what do I mean by poor neuromuscular control? Well, this is a good example of like someone about to do cutting, and you can see this is just a poor alignment. This person probably wouldn't move very fast to begin with, and if they did, there'd be a very good chance something would go, either the ankle, the knee, or the hip, and it's usually this one that's caught in the crossfire. So probably prior to that, this person would most likely have a lot of calf and heel problems, shin splints, possibly plantar fasciitis, maybe hip stiffness that gives them lower back pain. These are all warnings to the eventual bigger problem that may eventuate here. All right, so we see these problems really exposed when we do single leg stuff, a little bit in squats, but the squats tend to hide things at times. Lunges show it quite a fair bit, and the integration movements between hand and legs, the arms and legs that are on opposite sides, that also show this. So running technique, another big one too. So if you don't correct these motor control things, you're always at risk, and you're probably never going to perform as good as you could anyway. So let's take a look at some quick examples, and these are like an assessments that I use when I first meet people. All right, so let's have a really quick look at two different examples. Here's a very quick video that I've taken of two different people. Actually, neither of them with a knee injury, both of them, one with a foot injury and one with a back injury. All right, but you can actually see this video is actually a red flag for either of those injuries, but also if they were both playing sports, which they're not because of their injury, but if they were, there'd be a very high chance of an ACL injury with the mechanism of how they move. All right, so with every client that we see, I always, the very first meeting, I always sort of have a look at this as with a couple of other movements, but this one really gives away a lot. So if I play the first one, this one's like a foot injury, all right? So basically you'll see what's happening as she goes to squat down, and we have a look at both sides, and that right there is the poor motor control. And in this case it looks like the foot is okay, but very much poor control at the hip. This is the point of no return. This is where at high speed, this is where you will crush that ACL and bad things will happen. We have a look at the other side again, and here we go. So let's have a look. And again, you'll sort of see, there he goes right in, and so you can see these angles, just horrible, and it's just that poor motor control. So if that's happening on a single leg stance, you guarantee that that's going to happen when they cut or when they run, or landing from a jump, all right, which is even worse. Now, that was actually the better one of the two. This one's a lady that was seeing with a back injury, or a horrible back injury. Right, but you can sort of see how a poor hip control is actually leading to all sorts of trouble around her, from her feet all the way up, creating problems at her back. So the minute she goes to squat down, you'll see there's this horrible angle again. She can't even control it. And then we go to the other side, and it's probably worse. All right, so you can see again. So all these horrible angles of this is what we call the Q angle. So if I go back to this one, and I'll play them both for you. There you go. So this is what we're looking at, and this is why females are at greater risk. So this girl's got great foot stability, and we actually got her shoes off because we wanted to track the feet. And in this case, we could have done the same thing for her, but hers is actually probably worse. You can see how this knee's really getting bent in horrible angles that just not designed to do. So that gives you an understanding what neuromuscular control is, and that's why you must, and you can't just look at the knee. The knee is actually the one that has the least influence. It's the foot and the hip that are doing both of. So the foot either excessively pronating, or it's got not enough movement through the ankle, or the hip just driving too much internal rotation. But the knee itself really has nothing to do with trying to correct this or prevent it. So it's got to come from those joints and the brain and coordinating it all together, because maybe there's nothing wrong with these joints. It's just basically they don't know how to control it when they move. They don't know how to stabilise it. So this is why we call it a neuromuscular motor control problem, because this is the only way they know how to move with a single leg stance. Until you change that, the risk is always great. All right, so that's an example of what motor control neuromuscular problems look like. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed those, and that gave you a bit of an insight into what I mean by neuromuscular control. So what do I mean by anatomy? Well, if we have a look at the male structure, if you just try and think of the structure, all right, so the bones, and you sort of see here the pelvis and is sort of like stacked right upon the knee. You see, and that's really important, because when we move, it means that the knee's not getting pulled into alignments that it can't handle. So this is really good control when we see this. Right now, you have a look at the female body, because it's it has a wider pelvis, there's a alignment issue before she's even moved. All right, and this is what we call a Q angle. So the Q angle means quadricep angle, and normal is about a 5 to 20 degrees, but in females it's usually a lot more than that. And then so already you can see like this knee's exposed to a poor angle because it's not, the knee's not stacked under the hip and the ankle. It's not in a straight line. You see all of this is going to line up. This is not going to line up. This is what we're going to see and what we saw in that assessment before, and it just gets exacerbated when there's things going wrong. Now in addition to that, if I look at side on, the typical posture we see in a female is a lordosis type posture with her knees possibly hyperextended, so it's sort of the ankle's locked in plantar flexion, which means that it's really hard to get a good angle on a squat because you're really always pointing your toes instead of being able to get the angle where it needs to come forward. So now you're exposing it to more problems, and with the anterior tilt creates more internal hip rotation, so we get more of this, we get stronger adductors, tighter hips, which actually makes it get better and better at it. And the things that are opposing this are like the glutes, which give us external rotation. They're actually in a very poor position to do anything, and because of their nature of being weak and lazy, they just get worse. So you now, before you've even started, you're already against it. All right, so you can beginning to see how it all sort of ties together. All right, so now when we talk about quad to hamstring ratio, this all sort of comes back to the last two things, and this is when we see poor squat form. And sometimes people are told, well, not sometimes, a lot of people are told don't let your knees go over your toes because it'll be bad for your knees, when it's actually exactly what you need to do to get a better ratio of this quad to hamstring, because you actually won't get very good quad strength, but you'll get a huge amount of hip flexor tightness, which makes all the things we discussed worse. Overstretching hamstrings, and girls have have a lot more flexibility than males, which we'll go into in a second, but 60% to 80% of the injuries occur when the knee's flexed and forced into position of flexion and rotation. So the hamstrings work in combination with the ACL to resist the forward movement of the tibia. So the tibia is your shin bone. So the hamstrings are very, very important in decelerating that knee sort of being bang, flex forward and rotating over. And because the girls will have a lot more, they'll be relying on the hip flexors and the quad. Rectus femoris is a hip flexor and a quad. They really weaken their hamstring by just their posture. And if they start stretching the crap out of it, which we see all the time, that's why you see this, which looks impressive, but this is actually a precursor to knee problems because they don't have enough stiffness. They actually need to stiffen this up, need to reduce this. So that's not impressive at all. It's actually reasons why they have problems. So the greater the imbalance between the quads and the hamstring, the greater the chance of the ACL rupture. And every 10% reduction of this equals another 10% greater risk. So the further apart the quads and hamstrings get, the greater the risk it becomes. All right. So and we've already seen before you even started, already heading that way. So if you're doing exercises to encourage it, well, now you really increased your odds of 10% to become even closer to a rupture. All right. So now when we touched on joint laxity, so basically females have a greater generalized joint laxity due to lack of muscle mass, and basically to allow the body to prepare for childbirth, because if you were stiff as like a male, you wouldn't be able to get the baby out, probably die from giving birth. So naturally you've got hormones and just a structure that's not meant to be stiff. It's not meant, it has to have that laxity for a reason, which becomes a problem when we need stiffness, which we call good stiffness for a pivot and a cut. If you don't have stiffness here, you're gonna have problems. So you can sort of see, just if you've just genetically got this hypermobility happening, you really need to work out how to stiffen up a bit. Really learn stiffness. It's good to have mobility, but if you've got too much, it comes at a cost to your stability, and in particular ones like the knee. So, and then we've spoken about already, the angles are already setting you against the 8 ball. So you don't really want to improve your flexibility if you've already got too much. So that's where stretching got to be treated very cautiously with females. A lot of males don't have enough, they need to get more, but a lot of girls have got way too much to begin with, and they really need to avoid doing it and need what we call good stiffness. All right, poorly designed strength training program. So an intelligent method of selecting exercises is needed. you can't just use any type of leg exercise and think it's going to be great for you. So leg press is not going to change a cutting movement. It's not going to change how you land on a single leg. I don't care how strong you're going to get, you're actually probably going to make things worse. All right, so it's not a neuromuscular change with strength. You have to use things that actually require it. So this is an article I found. You just Google ACL injuries, and this is someone saying that, you know, this is for this is a recent one too. You know, and you can see here, high knee, shuttle runs, walking lunges, squats and plankings. None of these things, besides maybe the squats, are probably going to change anything. But if they're poor form squats, poor form lunges, like some of these probably already look like they are, you're actually going to be exacerbating the problem, not helping it. So the things you thought that were going to make it better are really getting you closer to blowing the knee out. You're giving a false sense of illusion and maybe reinforcing their faulty lunge. So it's just dumb, and planks don't change this. All right, they're just a crap exercise for that in general. They just don't change movement forms at all. The last thing we've sort of look at is ignorance to looking at the cause of problems. So we've shared this in many videos before, and this is from one of our other videos. This is where we're talking more about hip osteoarthritis and back problems, but really it could be any of these joints can be caused from faulty patterns. You know, if the hip doesn't have mobility enough, then it forces knee into instability, creating problems. So if there's too much mobility at certain things where it needs it, then that's also a problem. So you really have to look at the entire chain from the ground up, because as we saw in those assessments before, sometimes it was coming from the hip and sometimes it was coming from the foot. And then we need to look at all these different movement patterns, because some might be good and some might be terrible. And the ones that are terrible are the ones that bad things are going to happen. And it's usually this one that we see at the worst, and that one. So ignorance to looking at the feet. So instead of wasting time with planks and VMO exercises, they really have no chance of changing a pattern. You really need to look at those things that we just saw, and and in particular with girls, because they tend to wear high heel shoes at times. They've now created, put themselves in that, like we spoke about before, their foot's sort of locked in this plantar flexion, which means they can't squat quite correctly. Because they can't squat correctly, they can't jump correctly, because that's the squat is made from a jump. So then we start to see these issues here that we saw in that assessment before. All right, and this is where bang, the knee's the one that cops it. So what should you do? Well, there's a lot of things you need to do. So I don't make this video 2 hours long. I've just sort of summarized here, but basically you need to improve your movement skills. Single leg squats, and this is sort of and again from another one of the videos. You will find, go in the links underneath this video. There's heaps of in the description of this video. There's heaps of links I've provided for you to see all these different things. But really need to learn how to squat correctly, single leg squat correctly. Learn how to laterally move, create good stability before you start trying to strengthen it. And try to find the best way to sort of assess yourself and move through all the different patterns. So, and once you've done that, then you can start applying load to all these different patterns of movement: squat, lunge, bend, twist, push, pull. And looking at running technique is a big one as well. It's another thing that just people just ignore and just think they're good, and they're not. So just endless repetitions in their training, just leading them to the inevitable day where it just goes. So you really need to have a good assessment of your running form and have drills to try and correct it. It may never be perfect, but you should be trying to move towards something that's better than what you have now. And then eventually, after you've done your strength training, you're starting to move with a lot more faster stuff. So moving from a stable stuff to more dynamic, and where the stiffness is really applied, but it's sort of a similar movement, just more slow, controlled, and explosive. But this one can't be made until that one's done correctly in the first place. All right, so if you want more information, there's a free report you can get from our website that has a lot of stuff. There's a detailed knee pain program that we have, specifically with patella tracking and things like that are usually precursors to an ACL problem, and that gives you great in-depth information. Again, have a look in the description for the links. Very shortly, we're going to be launching our ACL injuries and sport program, so we're going to have a lot more sport-specific sort of programs and exercises and drills. So keep your eyes open for that. And and if anything, just take out the things from this video that are setting females up for injury. And if you're playing football right now, these sort of may get you looking into the right areas and what you need to do. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed that video, and I'll see you on our next one.